The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's ICU hummed their constant mechanical prayer as Margaret refilled her coffee at 0600, the bitter dregs mixing with the sharp smell of antiseptic and something underneath it, human suffering, mostly, the kind that didn't wash away. She wore scrubs 2 sizes too large, her dark hair pulled tight in a bun that had seen 3 years of double shifts, her movements efficient and small, the kind of movements people didn't notice. Nobody noticed much about Margaret Walsh. That was the point. She passed room 307 where a construction worker lay prepped for surgery, his chart already flagged for elevated intracranial pressure from a site accident 3 days ago. She'd been tracking his vitals since his admission 0400 this morning. His oxygen saturation had dipped to 94%, recovered to 96, then dropped again to 93. She made a note in the margin of his chart, her handwriting precise and tiny. The patient's right hand clutched something folded, a flag, American colors, worn at the edges. His brother's flag. He'd told her at 0300 when she'd checked his pupils for reactivity. She'd listened without speaking, her eyes steady on his, and he'd fallen asleep holding it. Dr. Pierce arrived at 0630 sharp, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the linoleum with the sound of someone announcing his own importance. His white coat was pressed sharp enough to cut paper, a gold Rolex catching the fluorescent light like a weapon. He moved through the ICU the way certain men move through rooms, as if the space itself had rearranged itself to accommodate his presence. He'd been running the ICU for 8 years, and in that time he'd built a kingdom made of inflated billing codes, phantom consultations, and a network of allied physicians who'd learned that questioning him cost more than it was worth. He scanned the unit with the practiced eye of a man counting his inventory. Margaret kept her head down, scrolling through the vitals on the construction worker's monitor. O2 sat holding at 96. Heart rate steady at 88. The pressure readings concerned her. The chart showed that neurosurgery had cleared him for the procedure, but the last note was dated yesterday at 1400, and the patient's condition had been deteriorating in smaller increments ever since, the kind of deterioration that might matter in the next 6 hours. She pulled up the medication order, metoprolol 50 mg PO twice daily, which was standard for perioperative hypertension management. She scrolled back to the original order written by Pierce at 0215 this morning. Then she scrolled to the billing codes attached to the consultation. The room around her seemed to narrow. She read the numbers a second time, making sure she hadn't made an error in her understanding. The metoprolol order was written at a dose that would have masked a second medication charge, a phantom neurosurgical consultation that had never actually happened, billed under the patient's name to his insurance at a rate of $2,847. 2 consultations, actually. One from Pierce himself at 0100, one from a Dr. Conrad Hayes at 0145, neither of whom had actually documented seeing the patient. She'd been working ICU long enough to know how the system worked, how these minor adjustments in medication timing created the space where false consultations could nestle. She'd also been working at St. Michael's long enough to know that correcting it meant acknowledging that she'd noticed. She made a new order. Corrected dose. Removed the phantom consultation codes. Signed her name. Hit submit at 0628. Pierce saw her do it. He was standing at the medication dispensary, waiting for his coffee from the nurse who always made it too hot because she was terrified of him, and he watched Margaret's face on the wall monitor as she clicked submit. His expression didn't change. He took his coffee and walked toward her with a pace that suggested he had all the time in the world and none of it was being wasted on mercy. Margaret. He said her name the way someone says a word in a language they don't quite respect. Let's review room 307 with the family. She looked up. Doctor? The construction worker. His wife and 2 adult sons are here. We're going to present his case. You'll walk me through his charting. He was already moving toward the room, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that made disagreement feel impossible. Come. Room 307 smelled like hope and fear in equal measure. The wife sat on a plastic chair that squeaked when she shifted her weight. The 2 sons stood against the window, their shoulders mirroring each other's tension. The patient lay in the bed, his hand still touching that folded flag. Pierce entered like a general entering a conquered territory, and he began to speak. "Your husband is stable," he said, which was true. "But we need to monitor his intracranial pressure very closely. I've ordered comprehensive neuro consultations." He paused. Let that sink in. Margaret walked the family through his vitals from the last 72 hours. Margaret stepped forward. She was already speaking, her voice steady, clinical, pressure readings from admission. "Actually," Pierce interrupted, and his voice had developed an edge like a knife finding a whetstone, "let's talk about your competency first. Margaret, when you see a medication order, what exactly is your responsibility?" The room went quiet. The wife's hands tightened on her purse. The son stopped breathing. "To verify it's appropriate for the patient's condition, doctor." "Right. And when you identify an order that you believe might be, what was the word you used, inappropriate, what do you do?" "I consult with the prescribing physician." "You consult?" He turned to the family, his smile spreading like oil on water. "Not unilaterally change orders written by the attending physician. Not delete consultations that were medically necessary. Not make decisions about care in isolation. But consult." He looked back at her. "Though I wonder if Margaret understands the difference between basic competency and catastrophic overreach. Tell me, Margaret, do you have any surgical training?" She didn't answer. She had every kind of surgical training, but answering that question truthfully would require her to explain things she couldn't explain, couldn't access, couldn't claim. So she held her breath and let the silence build like pressure in a sealed chamber. "No?" Pierce continued, as if she'd answered. "No surgical training. Yet you felt qualified to modify orders related to neurosurgical management. That's troubling. That's actually," he turned back to the family. "I apologize. Your husband's care has been compromised by someone with no background in surgical decision-making attempting to practice medicine. I'm reassigning his case to a senior resident immediately. Margaret, you'll be shadowed on all future medication verifications. No more independent charting." A single tear escaped down Margaret's cheek. Just one. She let it fall without wiping it away, let them all see it, and then she met Pierce's eyes across the room and spoke with the kind of quiet that lives in the spaces between heartbeats. "I followed protocol to the letter, doctor, and we both know it. The order I corrected would have masked a phantom consultation. The metoprolol dose you wrote creates a billing structure that doesn't match documented clinical need. I have a responsibility to patients. I did my job." The wife leaned forward. One of the sons stepped away from the window. Pierce's face remained smooth, but his jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough to show that the blow had landed. He didn't respond. He simply turned and walked from the room, his shoes clicking against the tile like a countdown. Margaret stayed with the patient and his family for another 4 minutes, answered their questions about vitals and pressure readings, let them see that she knew exactly what she was doing. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. When she finally stepped into the corridor, the fluorescent light seemed brighter, harsher, like they were examining her instead of illuminating her. She returned to the medication dispensary and began filling medication trays for the morning rounds, her movements precise as surgical instruments. But that wasn't the worst part. What she didn't know was that Pierce was already in his office making phone calls. The construction worker in room 307 had been awake for 3 days straight, his brain swelling inside his skull like a fist clenching tighter and tighter. Marcus Rodriguez, 42 years old, had taken a steel beam to the left temporal bone on a Tuesday morning. Now it was Friday, and the swelling had become a countdown. Margaret stood at his bedside at 1,400 hours, explaining pre-op protocols to his family, his wife Elena with her rosary beads, 2 teenage sons with their arms crossed, his elderly mother in the corner chair who hadn't spoken since arriving. "The neurosurgeon will need approximately 4 hours," Margaret said quietly, her hands folded at her waist, her voice the careful calibration of someone who'd learned to take up the least possible space. "We'll monitor intracranial pressure continuously. If there's any." The door pushed open like a statement. Dr. Pierce entered mid-step, his white coat moving before his body caught up, and his voice cut across hers like a blade through surgical tape. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I apologize that Nurse Nightingale here is confusing you with details beyond her basic competency." The words landed exactly as intended. Margaret's breath caught, one measured inhale through her nose. Elena's face flushed red, embarrassed for the woman who was trying to help her. Pierce continued, his smile calibrated for the family's benefit. "Margaret means well, but she doesn't understand the complexities of neurosurgical intervention. That's why we have doctors." The eldest son shifted uncomfortably. Marcus's mother gripped her rosary tighter. Margaret met Pierce's eyes. One tear formed in her right eye, not from pain, but from the weight of it, the sheer deliberate cruelty designed to be witnessed. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her voice steady as still water. "I followed protocol to the letter, Dr. Pierce, and we both know it." The room went dead silent. Pierce's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course you have, Margaret," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy, "the kind that poisons everything it touches." He turned back to Elena, his face switching to warmth like a light switch. "Your husband is in excellent hands. We'll have him back to you by evening." He left the room moving like a man who'd just won something. But that wasn't the worst part. What Margaret didn't know was that Pierce was already planning the rest of the assault. The second strike came at 12:30 the next day. Margaret entered the break room with her packed sandwich, tuna on wheat, an apple, a bottle of water she'd brought from home. The conversations died mid-word. Dr. Chen grabbed his coffee and left without making eye contact. Two nurses suddenly remembered charting that couldn't wait. Within 90 seconds, Margaret sat alone at a table built for 8, the hum of the vending machine her only company. She unwrapped her sandwich. Ate it. Didn't taste it. This was a message delivered in silence, and silence was Pierce's language now. The pattern held for 3 days straight. She sat, they scattered like birds sensing a hawk. No one spoke to her directly. No one met her eyes. The ICU hallway seemed to widen around her, a space of empty air expanding and contracting with each shift. Colleagues she'd worked with for 3 years suddenly had urgent business in other units whenever she approached. The message was written in the air: "You are untouchable, and not in the way you'd want to be." The third strike was public execution. Day 4, at 1,615 hours, Pierce posted a formal written warning on the unit board beside the staff schedule where every nurse, doctor, and orderly would pass it twice per shift. Margaret saw it during the change of shift briefing at 1700, when the ICU was loudest, most crowded, most witnessing. The paper was printed on official hospital letterhead, her name centered at the top like a headline. Disciplinary action, M. Walsh, failure to follow chain of command, unauthorized patient interaction, insubordination. 15 staff members pretended not to watch as Margaret stood before it. Her jaw tightened, just barely, a muscle contracting beneath the skin. One tear escaped, tracking down her cheek like a fault line. She wiped it away, her hand steady, turned to where Pierce stood 3 feet behind her, and said quietly, "I've documented every interaction, every order, every protocol I've followed. This won't stand." Pierce leaned in, his voice low enough only she could hear, his words meant to penetrate like a knife. "You're nobody, Nightingale. You have no allies here. I've made certain of that." Then he smiled, turned, and walked away, knowing she couldn't follow, couldn't protest publicly, couldn't do anything but stand there and absorb it. Margaret said nothing. Her hand stayed at her sides. But something shifted behind her eyes, a door closing and locking, a light going out and being replaced by something else. Muscle memory. The kind that comes from survival. Then the monitor alarm started. At 1847 hours, Marcus Rodriguez began seizing violently in room 307, his body jackknifing against the bed rails, his monitors screaming a 3-alarm symphony of chaos. Blown pupil. Posturing. Herniation syndrome. The brain swelling had won the war. Margaret was first through the door, not running, but moving with the precise efficiency of someone who'd done this before, who knew the arithmetic of dying minutes. The folded flag from Marcus's fallen teammate tumbled to the floor, forgotten. Pierce was in the doctor's lounge 2 floors up, reviewing lab work. The on-call neurosurgeon was stuck in traffic on Route 58, 30 minutes minimum out. The patient had 4 minutes, maybe 5, before irreversible brain damage locked in. Margaret assessed the situation in under 10 seconds. Get me a cranial drill kit. 14-gauge Steinman pin. We're doing emergency burr hole drainage here, now. Her voice was different, the careful deference gone, replaced by something that sounded like command. 2 wide-eyed residents scrambled to comply without questioning why a nurse was giving orders in a neurosurgical emergency. They moved because Margaret's voice had changed, had dropped an octave, had become the kind of voice that belongs to people who've watched people die and decided not to let it happen again. She prepped the site with practiced speed, her hands moving through the steps like they were hardwired into her nervous system. The drill went in. The whirring sound like a dentist's chair in a war zone. The resistance of bone against the bit, that specific pressure her fingers had learned to read the way other people read words. Around her, the ICU had gone quiet, not the quiet of respect, but the quiet of witnessing something that didn't fit the narrative everyone had been sold about who Margaret Walsh was. The surgical resident assisting her was Jake Morrison, 27 years old, former Army combat medic, 101st Airborne Division, now in his 3rd year of medical school at Eastern Virginia. He watched her hands, the angle of the burr hole, the controlled depth, the way she palpated for landmarks without looking down, just feeling the anatomy the way a musician feels keys. The speed. The absolute certainty. This wasn't nursing technique. This was something else entirely. Where did you learn to operate like that? Morrison whispered as Margaret drained the subdural hematoma with movements so precise they belonged in an operating room, not an ICU bed surrounded by machines and chaos. His voice held something more than curiosity. It held recognition. Margaret met his eyes for exactly half a second. She said nothing, not a word, not a sound, but Morrison saw it there anyway. Muscle memory written in the set of her shoulders. The calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The knowledge living in her hands, in the way she moved through this crisis like someone who'd done field thoracotomies under fire, under conditions far worse than a well-lit hospital room, who'd kept people alive in the backs of helicopters with nothing but a combat knife and nerve and the absolute refusal to watch someone die on her watch. The patient's vitals stabilized. Intracranial pressure dropping. O2 sat climbing from 67 to 78 to 84. Marcus Rodriguez had just been pulled back from the edge of a cliff he didn't even know was there. Morrison stared at her hand still holding the drill, his mind racing through possibilities he couldn't quite articulate. "You've done field thoracotomies, haven't you?" he said, not a question but a statement. She stripped off her gloves without answering, her face unreadable as a stone wall. "Chart this as temporizing intervention pending specialist arrival," she said quietly. "Call Dr. Patel's office. Tell him the patient is stabilized and ready for OR." She walked away before Morrison could press further. He watched her go, his mind filing away a connection he knew he shouldn't make, a truth he sensed but couldn't prove. That wasn't nursing skill. That was combat training. That was someone who'd been trained to operate under conditions that would make civilian doctors freeze. That was captain-level field medicine, the kind only special forces medics learned, the kind that required years of training and live combat scenarios and a willingness to operate in chaos. Pierce arrived in the ICU at 19:03 hours, 23 minutes after the emergency had resolved. He took one look at the patient stabilized in the bed, the resident standing nearby with charts, and his face shifted through several emotions in sequence: surprise, calculation, and finally, a smile that didn't extend to his eyes. "Excellent stabilization," he said to Jake Morrison, placing a hand on the resident's shoulder in a gesture that felt like a claim. "Your quick thinking may have saved this man's life. This is the kind of initiative that separates good doctors from great ones." Morrison looked at Pierce, then back toward the hallway where Margaret had disappeared. "The quick thinking came from," he began, but Pierce was already talking, already rewriting the moment into a narrative where the credit belonged to him, where Margaret remained the footnote, the nurse, the person without the title to claim what her hands had just accomplished. The narrative that mattered had already been written on that unit board. The one that said she'd failed. The one that said she couldn't be trusted. The one that said her name was Margaret Nightingale, and she was nobody. But Morrison would remember. He would remember the angle of that burr hole. He would remember the way she'd moved. He would remember that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone has been taught to underestimate, the one standing quietly in the corner while everyone else was building their empires of noise and credential and reputation. He would remember that she'd saved a man's life not because she had to, not because it was her job, but because someone else decided she was nothing, and Margaret Walsh had responded by proving that nothing could move mountains. The question wasn't what she'd done. The question was what Pierce had done, and whether he understood yet that he'd just made his first real enemy. An enemy who didn't fight back. An enemy who simply helped people live. An enemy who knew how to operate when everything was falling apart. The Marines arrived at 0620 hours on a Tuesday, dress uniforms pressed sharp enough to cut, faces forward, utterly silent. They escorted a man in a wheelchair through the ICU's electric sliding doors, Major General William Reeves, Special Forces Command, 3 tours in Kandahar, 2 in Baghdad, and 1 more than that classified. His jaw was wired shut. Metal plates held together what an IED had tried to separate across 3 city blocks in 2008. He couldn't speak. The chart said non-verbal, PTSD, trust issues, catastrophic maxillofacial trauma, no verbal communication documented in 6 weeks. The Marines left without a word. They didn't need to. The flag folded in the general's lap said everything. Sergeant First Class David Chen, KIA Baghdad, 2008, the fabric worn soft from being held. The general's hands never left it. His knuckles were white. His eyes tracked the ICU like he was still in Fallujah, still waiting for the next IED to turn the world sideways. Dr. Pierce saw him at 0800 and spent 8 minutes reviewing the chart. 8 minutes. He walked out saying the general was non-compliant, wasting resources, unsuitable for extended care. The next specialist came at 0900, ENT, recommended by Pierce, spent 12 minutes and left the same verdict. Then neurology. Then trauma surgery. Then psych. Then another. And another. 10 doctors in 36 hours, each one Pierce had called personally, each one spending less than 15 minutes in a room with a man whose hypervigilance was so sharp you could feel it like a blade in the air. The general's eyes never stopped moving. His breath came fast and shallow. His grip on the flag tightened every time a door opened. Margaret knew what she was seeing because she'd been seeing it in mirrors for 16 years. It was Wednesday at 1400 when the 10th doctor walked out, and Margaret was standing at the nursing station reviewing the general's deteriorating vitals, heart rate 138, climbing, O2 saturation at 89 and falling, blood pressure spiking up and down like someone was adjusting a live wire. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head, the distinctive hum that only people who'd worked nights for years could hear without wanting to scream. Through the crack in Pierce's office door, she caught fragments, personnel file from her previous hospital, any irregularities. I have 3 board members who will listen to me. He was making calls. He was activating the infrastructure. Whatever he was building, it would fall on her like a collapsing building, and soon. But not today. Not yet. Today there was a man in room for 12 whose heart rate was climbing toward catastrophic, whose eyes had the specific geometry of someone who had seen death up close and was expecting its return. Margaret moved slowly into the room. Hands visible. No sudden motions. She didn't approach the bed. She pulled a chair from the corner, positioned it 6 feet away, far enough to not be a threat, close enough to be present, and sat down. She didn't speak. She didn't reach for his hand or his chart or the flag. She just sat there, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady and audible, the kind of breathing that says I am not afraid and I am not leaving. The general's eyes moved to her, tracked her movements, assessed the threat level. His grip on the flag stayed tight. His breathing stayed rapid. But his hand relaxed a millimeter. 30 minutes passed. No words. Just presence. Margaret's hands folded in her lap. Her eyes soft. The kind of attention that doesn't demand, that doesn't require performance or compliance. After 30 minutes, the general's heart rate dropped from 138 to 118. The numbers on the monitor moved like they had permission. 2 hours. Margaret hadn't moved. She'd let the weight of her own silence fill the space between them. A nurse came to check vitals. Margaret raised one hand, a gesture so small it could have been nothing, and the nurse stepped back and left. The general's eyes tracked her, tracked the gesture, understood the boundary being held. 3 hours. The flag shifted slightly in his hands. His jaw unclenched just enough that the wires showed their work without cutting so deep. Margaret had seen similar mechanisms in field hospitals where the only language was patience. Where people who had been shattered slowly learned that not everything in the world moved like shrapnel. For hours and 50 minutes. Margaret spoke for the first time, her voice low enough that if he couldn't hear it, that would be fine. The flag is safe. It's not going anywhere. Neither am I. The general's eyes locked onto hers. Not a threat response. Recognition. The specific look that comes from one person seeing into another person and understanding that the horrors they'd witnessed had witnesses. That the dead they carried weren't carried alone. His breathing shifted. Deeper. Slower. His heart rate on the monitor, 107, stable, the rhythm reassembling itself like a broken bone finding alignment. His hand, the one gripping the flag, relaxed enough that his fingers moved a little. Just a little. But movement that said, I am beginning to trust this. 5 hours. The general's eyes closed for 10 seconds. Then longer. 20 seconds. His head tilted back against the pillow. Sleep. Actual sleep, the kind that only comes when the body believes, for the first time in days, that it won't be attacked in the dark. Margaret sat there for another 30 minutes after that, not because protocol required it, but because something deeper than protocol had been established in that room. A contract made of silence and patience and the shared understanding that both of them had learned to survive by becoming invisible. When she finally stood to leave, she moved with the same deliberation she'd used to sit down. The general didn't wake. His hand still held the flag. His breathing remained steady and deep. The ICU hallway smelled like antiseptic and the peculiar staleness that comes from fluorescent lights running 24 hours a day. Margaret's badge felt heavier than it had that morning. She knew what was waiting for her in the next room, the one with the administrative meeting scheduled, the one with the phone calls being made to people she'd worked with years ago, to people Pierce was telling stories about her to, stories that would spread like infection through the channels that determined whether nurses kept their jobs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she knew exactly what came next, and for the first time in 3 years at St. Michael's, she realized she didn't care about hiding anymore. The general had seen her hands work. The resident with the combat medic background had seen her precision. And now Pierce was going to activate every weapon he had, and Margaret was going to let him, because she'd learned a long time ago that sometimes you don't win by fighting back. You win by letting people reveal exactly who they are. She needed coffee. Strong, black, the kind that tastes like burnt machinery and late nights. I'm going on break, she said to no one in particular, heading toward the break room. Her voice sounded calm. That was the only part that mattered, that nothing in her tone suggested she'd just spent 5 hours sitting with a broken man and putting him back together. Dr. Pierce made 3 phone calls before breakfast Thursday morning. The first was to Richard Sterling, a board member whose consulting firm had received $340,000 in hospital referrals over the past 18 months, referrals that existed only on paper. Sterling answered on the second ring. Pierce didn't need to be explicit. I'm concerned about one of our nurses, he said carefully. Margaret Walsh. There's been some instability in her personnel history. You might want to ask Human Resources to pull her file from Norfolk General. Sterling understood. The second call went to a Dr. Halloway at Margaret's previous hospital in Virginia Beach, where she'd worked 5 years before St. Michael's. Pierce used leading questions like a surgeon probing for infection. "I'm just trying to understand her background," he said smoothly. "We've had some episodes. I wondered if you'd seen anything similar? Any behavioral concerns? Any situations where she didn't follow chain of command?" Holloway, unprepared for the trap, answered with the kind of vague institutional caution that Pierce could reshape into whatever narrative he needed. The third call was to Dr. Patricia Chen, the Chief of Nursing Quality Assurance, a woman who'd authorized 3 of his billing code expansions without question. "Pat," he said, his voice lowered to confidential tones, "I need you to understand this isn't personal. But we have a nurse creating boundaries that concern me. Therapeutic relationships that may have crossed into inappropriate territory. I'm not saying anything definitive, but I think we need to protect ourselves." By 8 a.m., 2 HR investigators arrived at St. Michael's with printouts and flagged concerns. By 10:19 a.m., 3 board members, Sterling among them, held an emergency closed-door review in the hospital administrator's office. They didn't interview Margaret. They didn't ask her side. They reviewed a personnel file that suddenly contained anonymous concerns about stability, professionalism, and the potential boundary violations with patients. At noon on Thursday, Margaret was called to the director's office on the 4th floor. She rode the elevator with a stillness that felt like held breath. The director, a man named Castillo who'd never spoken to her directly before, sat behind his desk with the HR director on his right. Neither stood when she entered. "Ms. Walsh," Castillo began, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone reading from a script, "we've received multiple concerns regarding your conduct with patients. Specifically, creating what we're calling an unauthorized therapeutic relationship that violates patient boundaries and hospital policy." Margaret's hands were steady. Her breathing remained even. She could feel the physics of the moment, how the silence wanted to crack her, how the accusation was designed to land like a blade. But she'd been trained by people who understood pressure in ways these administrators never would. "I sat with a traumatized patient for 5 hours," she said quietly. "He needed presence. I provided care." Castillo shifted papers in front of him. "That's exactly the issue. You exceeded your scope without physician authorization." The HR director pushed a termination letter across the desk. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. You'll surrender your badge and exit the building within 15 minutes. Margaret picked up the letter. The words were generic, template, designed to survive scrutiny. She was being erased. That was the point. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for a union rep or an appeal. She simply stood, folded the letter, and said, "I understand." The worst part happened in front of 30 people. Margaret walked from the director's office to her locker in the nurse's station with Castillo's assistant beside her, a young woman who looked like she wanted to disappear. Security stood by the main desk, 2 officers in grey uniforms, waiting. Margaret opened her locker. She pulled out her things, a sweater, a protein bar she'd never eaten, a photograph of her sister's kids that had lived on the shelf for 8 months. She placed her ID badge on the counter. The assistant produced a small handheld device, something that looked like scissors but wasn't quite. She hesitated. Margaret nodded at her, small permission, and the woman pressed the badge into the device. The snap was audible across the entire nursing station. The laminated card split cleanly in half. Margaret watched it happen with the kind of detachment that comes from understanding you're being erased. The room had gone quiet, the quiet that happens when people realize they're watching someone's life break in public. Morrison stood in the med-room doorway, his jaw tight enough to crack. A nurse named Sarah turned away. No one made eye contact. Margaret picked up the halves of her badge and placed them in her pocket. The security officer, a woman with grey streaking her hair, gestured toward the exit. "I'll walk you out," she said quietly, and there was something like apology in her voice. The general's heart monitor spiked to 160 the moment he saw Margaret being escorted past his window. His eyes tracked her through the glass, watched her disappear around the corner. Morrison saw the spike, saw the general's chest heave with panic, and moved to the bedside. "She's okay," Morrison said, though he had no idea if that was true. "She's going to be okay." The general didn't believe him. His blood pressure began dropping by mid-afternoon, creeping from baseline down toward concerning, then into dangerous territory. His heart rhythm shifted into atrial fibrillation, irregular and rapid. The lab work that came back at 4 p.m. showed elevated troponins, the markers of cardiac damage. Stress cardiomyopathy. His heart was literally breaking from her absence. Pierce rotated 3 different nurses through the general's room over the next 18 hours, each one competent, each one unknown to him. The general refused their care with the kind of subtle violence that only the deeply traumatized can manage. He wouldn't let them touch his 4 lines. He turned his face to the wall when they approached. His vital signs deteriorated in a slow cascade, a chart that looked like a line going down an invisible cliff. By Friday at 2 a.m., his heart stopped entirely. VFib. Ventricular fibrillation. The monitor showed the wild electrical chaos of a heart that had given up. The code team ran the protocol: compressions, epinephrine, defibrillation, more epinephrine. 18 minutes. That's how long they worked before getting return of spontaneous circulation. His rhythm converted back to sinus, but barely. He was still circling the drain, a man whose body understood what his broken jaw couldn't say, that the one person who could save him had been erased from the building. At 2:45 a.m., Morrison made a choice. He'd been a surgical resident for 4 years, which meant he understood hierarchy and consequences and the weight of insubordination. He also understood that Margaret Walsh had performed field medicine under enemy fire, which meant she understood life and death in ways Pierce never would. He stood in the stairwell outside the ICU and dialed her number from memory. She answered on the 3rd ring. No greeting, no confusion at the hour. Just, "Morrison." A statement, not a question. "He's coding," Morrison said. "I can't stop it. The doctors, they're missing something. I don't know what." The silence on the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, "Send me his last full labs. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She hung up. Morrison texted the results from his phone, his hands moving with the precision of someone who understood he might be ending his career. The troponins, the electrolytes, the CBC. Everything. At 3:20 a.m., Margaret Walsh walked back through the doors of St. Michael's in jeans and an oversized sweater that hung from her frame like borrowed skin. No badge. No credentials. No authority by any system that mattered. Her hair was pulled back with a rubber band. She looked like a ghost returning to the place it was murdered. Pierce was asleep at home, confident his problem had been solved. Morrison met her in the hallway outside the procedure room. "His heart's failing," she said, not a question. "Massive catecholamine surge from psychological trauma. He needs volume, needs calcium, needs..." She stopped herself. She didn't need to explain field protocol to him. "What's the current line?" "Central line in the right subclavian," Morrison said. "For access everywhere. Get me type O blood. 2 units hanging. I need 10 milligrams calcium chloride, push. I need him on continuous monitoring." The surgical resident, the same one who'd watched her hands during the burr hole drainage, had already started the 4 medications. Margaret scrubbed in. Her hands moved through the preparation with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in sandstorms and firefights and field hospitals that weren't hospitals at all. She spent 5 hours in what amounted to surgery without being a surgeon. The general's heart needed intervention, needed someone to understand that his circulatory collapse wasn't a medical problem, it was a crisis of absence. Margaret worked with hands that had held lives together in Baghdad, in places where the difference between breathing and not breathing was measured in seconds and the person next to you was usually about to bleed out on your boots. She ran fluids wide open. She managed his potassium and his magnesium and the electrical chaos his heart was throwing. Morrison watched her move, watched her anticipate what needed to happen before the monitors told her it was happening. This was the person who'd been erased in front of 30 people. This was the person who'd spent 5 years hiding the fact that she could do things no regular ICU nurse should be able to do. At 8:20 a.m., the general's eyes opened. They locked immediately on Margaret's face. His chest rose and fell with steady breath. The monitors beeped out normal rhythm, sinus, regular, the sound of a heart that had remembered how to live. His lips moved. It took enormous effort. His broken jaw meant the words came out as shape and breath, as much whisper as sound. "Reaper," he said, the call sign escaping his throat like prayer. Morrison's blood went absolutely cold. Reaper wasn't a patient nickname. Reaper was military designation. The kind of thing you only knew if you'd served with someone. If you'd trusted them with your life. The young Marine corporal stationed outside the ICU door stepped forward. He'd been there for 4 days, rotating duty with 2 other leathernecks, all of them under orders that no one in the hospital fully understood. His boots made a precise sound on the tile, tap, tap, tap. He reached into his dress jacket and pulled out a document. His hand was steady. His voice, when he spoke, carried the parade ground clarity of someone trained to project across distance. "Captain Margaret Walsh," he began, reading the citation in a voice that filled the procedure room like an announcement, "United States Army Medical Corps, Silver Star recipient, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Baghdad, Iraq, March 15, 2008. Margaret's face went white. "Captain." "Not nurse." "Captain." One of the nurses gasped, her hand covering her mouth as the word landed like a shock. The attending physician stepped backward, his eyes widening in the way of people who understand they've been standing next to something they didn't see. The Marine continued, his voice steady, each word carrying the weight of classified records finally declassified, where Captain Walsh performed 47 field surgeries under direct enemy fire over a 16-hour period, attached to 3rd Special Forces Group with operational designation Reaper, credited with saving 127 American and Allied lives during Operation Phantom Phoenix. Morrison whispered, "Jesus Christ," because 3rd Special Forces was Tier 1. That was the tip of the spear. That was the people they didn't talk about at hospital conferences. That was the kind of soldier who didn't exist officially, erased, classified, ordered to disappear by people in offices Margaret would never name. The door burst open. Dr. Pierce, called in by a resident he'd planted on the unit like a spy, his face red and ascending into fury. "This is highly irregular," he shouted, his voice cracking with the first notes of panic. "You can't just, there's procedure, there's protocol, this woman is terminated, she has no," the general himself moved. With monitor lead still attached, for lines pulling, a man who'd been unconscious 40 minutes before swung his legs over the bed with movements that looked impossible. The Marine moved to assist, but the general waved him off with the kind of authority that transcended injury. He lowered himself to his knees on the cold hospital floor. His right hand rose, trembling but precise, in a full military salute to the person standing before him. Margaret Walsh. Captain Margaret Walsh. The decoration she'd never worn. The medal she'd earned in the dark. The woman who'd spent 15 years erased, invisible, living as a ghost in scrubs. Pierce's voice died in his throat. The silence filled the room like pressure. 2 Pentagon officers in service dress appeared in the doorway at exactly 8:19 a.m., their arrival clearly coordinated, clearly planned. The senior officer wore the insignia of the intelligence branch, a colonel with eyes that had seen classified things. He spoke directly to Margaret. "Captain Walsh, code name Reaper, your sealed record has been reviewed under Executive Order 12333. Your service is acknowledged. You are released from non-disclosure effective immediately." The junior officer stepped forward, his voice low enough that only the room could hear. Captain Walsh was ordered to disappear after a black site operation in Baghdad went sideways in March 2008. Her service record was erased. Her decorations were sealed. She was told explicitly never to surface because officially, Captain Margaret Walsh has never existed. Margaret's hands were still gloved from surgery. Still sticky with the work of saving a life that 10 doctors had decided wasn't worth saving. A single tear tracked down her cheek, but this time she didn't wipe it away. The general, still kneeling, mouthed two more words, "Thank you." The ones who've seen the worst often give the most. The phone rang at 3 in the morning. Not Margaret's phone, the hospital's main line, routed to the night supervisor, who immediately transferred the call up the chain. By 3:15, the message had reached Margaret's apartment in Norfolk, delivered by a voice she recognized, Morrison, the surgical resident, now standing in the ICU watching the general's vitals collapse like a building in controlled demolition. "He's failing. We need you. I don't care what your paperwork says." Margaret didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She moved through her apartment with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before: shower in 4 minutes, scrubs on in 90 seconds, hands wrapped and ready. The drive took 11 minutes. The security guard at the entrance almost stopped her, then saw something in her face and stepped aside instead. The general lay in Trauma Bay 3, his chart a disaster written in red ink. 2 days without her presence, without someone who understood what his silence meant, and his body had begun shutting down like a building losing power floor by floor. Fluid in the lungs. Cardiac arrhythmia. Blood pressure dropping despite 3 separate infusions running wide open. The 10 doctors who'd examined him had all reached the same conclusion: he was a non-compliant patient with a poor prognosis, a waste of resources. They'd written their notes and walked away. Margaret didn't walk. She scrubbed in. The surgical team, Morrison and 2 attendings who'd never seen her work before, didn't ask who she was. They just cleared a path. 5 hours. That was the duration of what followed. Not 5 hours of watching someone else operate. 5 hours of Margaret Walsh, Captain Margaret Walsh, moving with the kind of precision that doesn't come from textbooks or residency programs. Her hand steady as surgical lasers. Her voice when she spoke clipped and direct, suction. More light. Bovie on bleed site. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just the muscle memory of field medicine compressed into the controlled environment of a modern OR, where the stakes were slightly lower but her instincts exactly the same. The first attendant watched her work a level for tachycardia down to 102 with nothing but fluid management and rhythm control. The second attendant saw her identify pericardial effusion before the echo confirmed it and watched her tap it with a needle so precise the patient's color came back in seconds. Morrison stood across from her, assisting, and realized he was watching a master class in trauma surgery being performed by a woman he'd thought was just a nurse for the past 18 months. By hour 3, the general's vitals had stabilized. By hour 5, he was no longer dying. He was sleeping, his respiration steady, his oxygen saturation rising back toward normal ranges like a climber summiting a mountain that should have killed him. Margaret stepped back from the table at 8:02 a.m., pulled off her gloves, and walked out without saying a word. Morrison followed her into the hallway, his voice catching somewhere between rage and awe. "Where in God's name did you learn to do that?" Margaret didn't answer. She just kept walking. The general opened his eyes 2 hours later. The first thing he saw was the ceiling of his hospital room. The second thing was Margaret, standing beside his bed, her hand steady on the guardrail. His eyes locked on hers, that same recognition, that same understanding of what had just happened. His jaw, rebuilt by surgeons but still marked with the scars of an IED blast, moved slowly. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, the words forced through a throat that had forgotten how to speak months ago. Reaper. One word. Her call sign. The name they'd given her in Baghdad when the body count of soldiers she'd saved in the field started climbing past 30. Past 40. The name that had been classified, sealed, buried in files that were supposed to stay hidden forever. The young Marine stationed outside the general's door heard that single word and understood everything. He stepped into the room, his uniform pressed sharp enough to cut glass, and pulled a folded citation from his jacket. His voice came out formal and deliberate, the way military men speak when bearing witness to something sacred. Captain Margaret Walsh. Silver Star recipient. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Baghdad. 47 field surgeries conducted under direct enemy fire. 0 surgical mortality rate. Citation commended by CENTCOM and Joint Special Operations Command. He read the dates. March 2008 through August 2008. The duration of her classified deployment. The months when officially, according to every government database, Margaret Walsh didn't exist. The general's eyes never left her face. Then, slowly, his hand moved to the edge of the bed. His leg swung over the side. His feet touched the floor. And then, impossibly, he lowered himself down onto his knees before her, his entire body trembling not with weakness but with something deeper, the kind of trembling that comes from bearing witness to sacrifice you'd thought was lost forever. His shaking hand rose. Not a salute of command, but a salute of honor. Of recognition. Of a soldier acknowledging a warrior who'd pulled him back from the edge of darkness when 10 other doctors had simply walked away. The door burst open. Dr. Pierce stood in the frame, his face red, his voice a shout that filled the entire room. This is highly irregular. This is a violation of protocol. Security, this woman is. The general's other hand came up. Not to salute, but to signal silence. His eyes fixed on Pierce with a clarity that hadn't been there in 2 days, and even without his voice, even voiceless, the message was unmistakable: you are dismissed. Pierce opened his mouth. Closed it. The Marines outside had already heard everything. The hospital director would hear about it within minutes. By lunchtime, every administrator in the building would understand that they'd fired a decorated officer without knowing her name. That afternoon, 2 Pentagon officers arrived in dress uniforms that had more ribbons than Pierce had surgical achievements. They didn't ask permission. They showed their credentials, pulled Margaret into a conference room, and confirmed what the citation had already revealed: Captain Margaret Walsh, code name Reaper, JSOC Task Force 121, currently operating under a sealed civilian cover until further notice. The classified record had just been unsealed. The general's public recognition had blown her cover wide open. We'll need to discuss your options, the senior officer said, sliding a folder across the desk. Your UCMB status, your back pay, your eligibility for reinstatement. Margaret didn't open the folder. St. Michael's fired me yesterday. The officer's jaw tightened. Not anymore. What neither of them knew was already happening 3 floors below in the hospital's IT department. Thomas Rodriguez, the network administrator who managed all security footage, had been serving in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve for 12 years, and he'd done 2 tours in Fallujah himself. When Dr. Pierce had walked into his office at 1:15 that afternoon demanding routine access to security footage archives, Rodriguez had given him the login credentials without hesitation. But Rodriguez had also, 48 hours earlier, backed up every frame of footage from the past week. Every conversation. Every phone call. Every moment of Pierce's campaign against Margaret. Including the footage from Thursday at 2:19 a.m., when Pierce had sat alone at a workstation and attempted to delete digital evidence of his own misconduct. The timestamp on his login. The files he'd targeted. The 43 minutes he'd spent trying to scrub his own guilt from the record. By 3 p.m., Rodriguez had called the state medical board. By 4 p.m., he'd called the hospital's legal team. By 5 p.m., Pierce was placed on administrative leave, and federal investigators were opening a file on his billing practices. The collapse happened fast after that. The board members who'd rubber-stamped Margaret's firing suddenly remembered they had lawyers. The specialists Pierce had called in for the general suddenly had patients to see elsewhere. Pierce sat alone in his office watching his career disintegrate in real time, watching the phone on his desk light up with calls he couldn't take, calls from people who'd become toxic by association. 6 months later, the Norfolk Community College's CPR certification program had a new instructor. His name was Dr. Edward Pierce. His hourly wage was $18.50. His medical license, once a badge of privilege and power, was now restricted to non-clinical educational settings only, meaning he would never operate again, never consult on a case, never hold the kind of institutional power that had let him destroy someone's career with a single phone call. The judge's final words had been precise: you weaponized your position against those who threatened to expose your scheme. You mistook quiet dignity for weakness. That was your fundamental error. The same afternoon that Pierce taught his first CPR class to a room of indifferent high school students, Margaret stood in her dress blues on the parade ground at Joint Base Norfolk. The first time in 15 years she'd worn the uniform publicly. The folded flag from Sergeant First Class David Chen was being lowered into the ground at Arlington Cemetery with full military honors, a ceremony the General, Major General James Reeves, now promoted based on his field record and sealed commendations, had refused to attend until now. Until Margaret helped him find his voice again. Literally. Months of therapy, speech specialists, the kind of patient work that only someone who'd served alongside him could provide. And now, standing at his teammate's grave, the General spoke his first public words in 18 months. His voice was halting, his words carefully chosen, his jaw still scarred but finally functional. Some debts can never be repaid. Some soldiers never stop serving. He turned and looked at Margaret in her dress blues, standing beside him, and everyone watching understood exactly who he was talking about. Margaret returned to St. Michael's 6 weeks later, but not as a nurse. As Director of Trauma Services, a position the hospital created specifically to keep her there, to acknowledge what she'd already proven, that the most dangerous warriors don't wear general stars. They wear scrubs. They move silently through trauma bays. They save lives with the precision of someone who's already saved 47 of them in the worst conditions imaginable. Morrison completed his residency under her guidance, specializing in combat-related trauma. Thomas Rodriguez from IT became head of hospital security. The construction worker from room 307, fully healed, brought his entire family to Margaret's office, his 2 teenage sons both enlisted as Army combat medics, inspired by the nurse who'd saved their father with skills no one was supposed to know she had. On her office wall hung a single photograph, Margaret and General Reeves standing side by side at Arlington, both in dress uniform, both finally home. Beneath it, a plaque with words the General had insisted on. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Margaret kept the coffee mug from that night, from the diner at 3 a.m. when she'd sat alone in a booth staring at her reflection in the dark window, wondering if she'd remain a ghost forever. Now it held pens on her desk, a reminder that some ghosts find their way back to the living, that some debts transcend paperwork and politics, and that the men who mistake silence for surrender are usually the first to fall. If you've made it this far, you know the real story isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when the world finally sees the people it's been invisible to all along. Subscribe. Share this with someone who knows what it feels like to be underestimated. And comment, have you ever judged someone only to discover you were catastrophically wrong?